4 tons of granite stand at the main entrance of a ranch 13 miles south of Vernon, Texas, and beneath that granite, a horse is buried in a standing position. The horse was named Poco Bueno. He was foaled in 1944 and purchased as a brown yearling in Stamford, Texas, in 1945 for $5,700, roughly $100,000 in today's money, and within a decade he had become the first quarter horse in American history insured for $100,000, which is close to $1, $2 million now. He died in 1969. The will of the man who owned him, E. Paul Waggoner, instructed that the animal was not to be laid down. He was to be interred upright, facing the road across from the gate at Zacawesta headquarters, and a 4-ton granite marker was set above him so that no one would ever mistake the spot for ordinary ground. The marker is still there. Cattle graze around it. Pickup trucks pass it before sunrise every working morning of the year. It is the only monument most outsiders will ever see on more than 500,000 acres, and it commemorates a horse rather than any of the 4 generations of human beings who assembled the largest ranch under one fence in the United States. That omission is not sentimental. It is the most honest thing on the property. Every chapter of this story follows the same pattern. Something saves the Waggoner. That thing makes it rich. And then that same thing becomes the force that hollows it out. Grass saved it, and grass brought the barbed wire that ended the open range. Water saved it, and the search for water produced oil that ruined the wells. Oil saved it, and oil money built a racetrack that the Texas legislature abolished in a single session. And the unbroken scale of the place, the one fence, the 500,000 contiguous acres that made it famous, is precisely what made it impossible to divide, and therefore impossible for any heir to leave. The Waggoner was never supposed to be an empire. It was supposed to be enough grass to keep 242 longhorns alive on land that nobody else in Texas wanted. The question this story turns on is not how one family got that rich. It is why, after more than a century and a half, not a single one of them could work out how to walk away with their share. To understand why nobody wanted that land, you have to go back roughly 280 million years, to the Permian, when the shallow inland seas that covered this part of North America were drying up. What they left behind was not soil in any generous sense. Between about 290 and 260 million years ago, evaporating basins deposited red mud, sandstone, gypsum, and salt across what is now north-central Texas. Formations geologists group under names like the Wichita, the Clear Fork, and the Pease River. The iron oxide in those beds is why the dirt is red, and why the Red River is called what it is. The gypsum and the salt are why the groundwater tastes like a rusted pipe. This matters more than any other geological fact in the story. On the Waggoner, water was chemically hostile long before anyone tried to drink it. There is a second problem, and it is arithmetic. This country sits near the 100th meridian, the informal line where the American climate stops being reliable. Wilbarger County receives roughly 25 inches of rain in an average year, which sounds adequate until you learn that the average is assembled out of years that deliver 40 and years that deliver 12. Farming country needs consistency. This land offers a bet. For thousands of years, the people who used it did not take that bet. The southern plains belonged to the Comanche, who did not farm and did not settle, but followed the bison across a territory so large that Spanish and Mexican authorities effectively conceded it for the better part of a century. What is now Wilbarger County was hunting ground for the Noconi, one of the Comanche divisions, into the 1870s. Their economy was grass converted into bison, converted into everything else, and it worked because grass is the one thing the red beds produce without being asked. European contact came early and left quickly. By at least one 19th century newspaper account, Coronado crossed this stretch of country in 1541 while hunting the imagined golden province of Quivira, though this may be legend rather than documented fact. What is not in dispute is the pattern. The Spanish looked at the red beds, found no gold, no timber, no navigable river, and no reliable water, and kept moving. Texas created Wilbarger County on paper in 1858, naming it for 2 settlers. Nobody settled it, not for 20 years. The county attracted its first permanent residents in 1878, and it took a war to make that possible. Between 1874 and 1875, the United States Army ran converging columns across the southern plains in what became known as the Red River War, and the decisive action was not a battle in any conventional sense. On September 28, 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie found a large Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne encampment in Palo Duro Canyon, drove the people out of it, burned the lodges and the winter food stores, and then captured the horse herd and had well over 1,000 animals shot. A plains people without horses in October is not a military problem. It is a starvation problem. Simultaneously, commercial hide hunters were removing the bison from the southern herd at a rate that reduced a population once estimated in the tens of millions to a few hundred scattered survivors within roughly a decade. In June of 1875, Quanah Parker brought his band into Fort Sill. Within 3 years, cattlemen were moving onto grass that had been effectively unavailable for as long as anyone had been counting. The land had not improved. The rain had not increased. The water was still full of gypsum. The only thing that had changed was who was permitted to stand on it. And that single change is the entire founding condition of every great Texas ranch, including this one. The man who stood on it first, in the way that mattered, was Daniel Waggoner. He was born in Lincoln County, Tennessee on July 7, 1828, and came to Texas with his family around 1848, settling at Blackjack Grove in Hopkins County. His father Solomon, a farmer who traded in horses and in enslaved people, died in 1849. Daniel married Nancy Moore. Their only child, William Thomas Waggoner, was born on August 31, 1852. Nancy died the following year, and Daniel was a widower with an infant son before he was 26. In 1854, he bought a herd of longhorns and moved west to a farm of 160 acres on Catlet Creek, in what is now Wise County. He brought his mother, his brothers and sisters, and a 15-year-old enslaved boy. He started with 6 horses and 242 head of cattle. 2 years later, he added 320 acres near Decatur. The reversed D that would become the most recognizable brand in Texas was first burned on June 11, 1849, which makes it one of the oldest continuously used brands in the state. He was buying, at various points across the following decades, land at roughly $1 an acre, which is something like $35 an acre in today's money, for country that would eventually be listed for sale at nearly $1,400 an acre. But the strangest transaction in the family's history was not a purchase at all. In the 1880s, needing more grass than Texas could give them, the Waggoners leased range across the Red River in Indian Territory, in a stretch of nearly 500,000 acres known as the Big Pasture, from the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache. The rate negotiated in that era ran around 6.5 cents an acre, roughly $2 in today's terms. The landlord was Quanah Parker, the last Comanche war chief, son of a Comanche warrior and of Cynthia Ann Parker, the white child taken in a raid in 1836 and recovered by Texas Rangers a quarter century later against her will. Waggoner money helped pay for Parker's house at Cache in Oklahoma, the 12-room white star house with stars painted on the roof, built large enough to hold his wives. The largest cattle operation in Texas was, for 2 decades, a tenant. Daniel Waggoner never learned to read and write with any facility, and it made no difference whatsoever to his balance sheet. By the end of his life, his interests included 5 banks, 3 cottonseed oil mills, and a coal company, and the land holdings had not grown from that first 160 acres on Catlet Creek to something approaching 1 million. He died on September 5, 1902, at 74 in Colorado Springs, roughly 600 miles from the grass he spent 50 years assembling. He never saw a barrel of oil come off it. The single most important character in this story is the son. William Thomas Waggoner, called Tom, lost his mother at 1, was raised by his stepmother Cicely Ann Halsell, and was trained by his father to handle stock and supervise men before he was old enough to vote. By 1870, they were partners under the name D. Waggoner and Son. That spring, a drive to Kansas cleared roughly $55,000, close to $1.2 million today, and every account of the family agrees this was the seed capital for everything that followed. What separated Tom Waggoner from 100 other successful cattlemen was that he correctly identified the problem, and the problem was never grass. It was movement, and it was water. Grass without transport is a subsistence business, and by 1900 he had positioned the ranch so that 3 railroads served it, which ended the annual drive up the Western Trail entirely. Water without chemistry is a mirage, and the Waggoner had water in the sense that it was wet. So he drilled, repeatedly, expensively, across the ranch and later around a small town on his land, and the wells kept coming up ruined. In 1903, when yet another hole produced crude instead of drinking water, Waggoner gave American business history one of its most misjudged quotations. He said he had wanted water, and they had got him oil, and that he was mad clean through. He did not stay mad. He was mad for about as long as it took to work out the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was overwhelming. Cattle require grass, water, weather, labor, transport, and a market that pays. Oil requires a hole. By 1911, he had formed a refining operation of his own, and the tank cars carrying his product across Texas were painted with the reversed triple D, which meant the brand that identified his calves was simultaneously functioning as a petroleum trademark. He founded the Waggoner National Bank of Vernon and served as its first president. Around his Zacawesta headquarters lay one of the major shallow oil fields in the world, developed in large part by the Texas Company, which the country would later know as Texaco. He owned interests in banks, cottonseed oil mills, and coal alongside the cattle. He married Ella Halsell, moved the family's social center to Fort Worth, while the working center stayed in Wilbarger County and became one of the men whose money physically shaped that city. He built El Castile in Decatur, the turreted stone house the family lived in during the early years, In 1903, he built Thistle Hill in Fort Worth for his daughter Electra when she married a Philadelphia heir named Albert Buckman Wharton, a man she had reportedly met while traveling in the Himalayas, and he built it in part because he did not want her living far from home. The house still stands and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. There's no reliable accounting of what Tom Waggoner was worth at his peak because the estate was a private trust and the mineral income was never published, but the shape of it can be measured from the other end. When the courts finally valued what he left behind, decades after his death, the land alone came to $110 million, and the estate as a whole to roughly $330 million in early 1990s dollars, which is somewhere near $750 million in today's money, and that was after 2 more generations had lived off it. Then, in his 70s, he built the thing that reveals him completely. Beginning in October of 1927, on his 3D stock farm halfway between Dallas and Fort Worth, he constructed Arlington Downs, a 1.25-mile track with a 6,000-seat grandstand, at a cost variously reported between $2 and $3 million, somewhere between $37 and $55 million in today's money. It opened on November 1st, 1929, 4 days after the stock market began to come apart. Pari mutual betting was illegal in Texas. Waggoner built it anyway and lost around $50,000 on the first season, roughly $900,000 now, because he intended to change the law. In the fall of 1931, patrons were arrested at the track for betting openly, and the resulting prosecution gave racing advocates the public argument they needed. In 1933, the legislature legalized pari-mutuel wagering and issued the first permit to Arlington Downs. He then put another $1 million into enlarging it. He died of a stroke in Fort Worth on December 11, 1934, at 82, and is buried at Oakwood Cemetery. He had legalized gambling in Texas and lived just long enough to watch it work. The numbers behind that spending were extraordinary and, for a long stretch, entirely reliable. Through the 1880s, the Waggoners were selling around 40,000 cattle a year. By 1900, the ranch was running 60,000 head. Between 1889 and 1903, the holdings consolidated into a block running roughly 30 miles east to west and 25 miles north to south, extending into Ford, Knox, Baylor, and Archer counties, while centering on Wilbarger and Wichita. And, at its greatest extent, the family controlled more than 1 million acres. Then came April 1st, 1911, when a well called Clayco No. 1 blew in a mile north of the town of Electra, named for Tom Waggoner's daughter, not, as is sometimes repeated, for his wife. The Electra field produced approximately 10 million barrels between 1911 and the middle of the 1920s. The town's population reached 5,000 within months of the discovery. Because the community already existed and because the mineral rights were already leased, so Electra never suffered the tent city chaos that wrecked other Texas boomtowns, the money arrived into an existing grid of streets and banks. Today, more than 5,000 pump jacks stand within a 10-mile radius, and in 2001, the Texas legislature formally proclaimed Electra the pump jack capital of Texas. The business model was as close to perfect as American land ownership gets, and it explains why nobody questioned it for 80 years. The Waggoners owned the surface, and they owned the minerals beneath it. Cattle and wheat covered the taxes and the payroll and the fences. Oil covered everything else, including the racetracks, the mansions, and eventually the lawyers. The ranch was not diversified in the modern sense. It was stacked. One property generated 2 unrelated income streams from the same dirt, and when beef prices collapsed, the oil kept paying, and when oil collapsed, the beef kept paying. A structure like that does not feel like a risk. It feels like physics. And the ranch eventually solved the water problem too, in the largest possible way. Reservoirs were built on the property, including Lake Kemp and Lake Diversion, impounding the same unreliable rainfall that had made the country worthless in the first place. One of them supplies municipal water to the city of Wichita Falls. The ranch that was founded because a man could not drink his own well now sells water to a city of 100,000 people. By the time anyone thought to inventory the whole operation, it ran to roughly 30,000 acres of cropland, something over 1,000 producing oil wells, several thousand head of cattle and 500 horses, all inside a single continuous fence enclosing more than 800 square miles. What happens next is the part almost nobody knows, and it is the reason a family that owned all of this ended up in a courtroom for 25 years. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel before we go on. By the middle of the 1930s, the town of Electra held 6,712 residents and 170 businesses. In 1926, at a smaller population of 4,644, it already supported a high school, a long list of churches, 2 newspapers, 2 banks, and more than 100 businesses. The Liberty Theater was showing Mary Pickford pictures by 1919. The Grand Theater opened its doors to a town where the streets smelled of crude oil and hot iron, and where the drinking water, even after the pipelines came, carried the mineral edge of gypsum that no filtration in that era could remove. Out on the ranch itself, life ran on a different clock. The operation was divided into 15 camps, each covering 20 to 30,000 acres, and a family lived at every one of them, responsible for the livestock, the fences, and the water within their piece of it. Twice a year, the wagon crew worked the cattle camp by camp, and men slept on the ground beside a chuck wagon that stayed out year-round. A cowboy needed a saddle, a bridle, and a bedroll. The rest was supplied: beef, beans, sourdough, black coffee. Roundups pulled in Anglo, Black, and Mexican hands, along with Comanche riders from across the river in the earlier decades, and the ranch employed men whose names survive in the record precisely because the work was dangerous enough to be remembered. Jimmy Roberts, who was a good enough shot to discourage rustlers without much conversation, and E.B. Gillis and Walter Lawrence, and a man everyone called Shinnery McElroy. The seasons of that life were fixed, and everybody knew them. Springworks, branding, shipping in the fall, and the Santa Rosa Roundup in Vernon, a rodeo the family ran and the whole county attended. The horses mattered as much as the cattle, and by the 1940s, the Waggoner was breeding quarter horses that would define the American standard for what a working ranch horse should be. In Vernon, 13 miles up the road from headquarters, a boy named Roy Orbison was born in 1936 to a family working the oil fields. Weddings happened in the camps. Children were born in them. People were buried in Wilbarger County ground that their grandparents had broken, and every one of them believed, with excellent evidence, that this arrangement was permanent. Here is the thing about the Waggoner at its peak that deserves to be said plainly, because it explains everything that came after. Every dollar of the real wealth was underneath the surface, it was finite, and it was distributed unevenly. You can walk a fence line and see the grass. You cannot walk a fence line and see which quarter section sits above a producing formation and which sits above dry red clay. That means that property could never be divided fairly, not by a surveyor, not by a court, not by brothers who liked each other. If you split 500,000 acres 3 ways, you are not splitting a ranch. You are running a lottery with the family's entire fortune as the prize, and the person who draws the dry sections has been robbed by geology rather than by anyone he can argue with. Everyone living through the boom experienced the ranch as a single organism. Nobody noticed that a single organism cannot be inherited by more than one person. The catastrophes arrived on schedule, and none of them were the one that mattered. In 1885, the open range began closing, barbed wire spread across the plains, and Texas fever quarantine legislation restricted the movement of southern cattle north, choking the trail economy. In 1893, the last large herd went up the western trail across Doan's Crossing, on the Red River just northwest of Vernon, where an estimated 7 million cattle and 1 million horses had passed since 1874. The Waggoners absorbed it because they had already stopped depending on drives and started depending on rails. On June 5, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed legislation opening the Big Pasture to settlement. The bill was written by Representative John Hall Stevens of Vernon, Texas, which means the Waggoners lost 500,000 acres of leased grass to a law authored by their own congressman. There is a further irony in the timing. In April of 1905, Roosevelt had spent 5 days in that same Big Pasture, coursing wolves as the guest of Burke Burnett and the Waggoners, with Quanah Parker in the hunting party, 17 wolves taken over 4 days of hunting, and Roosevelt wrote up the whole trip for Scribner's magazine that November, describing his hosts as old-style Texas cattlemen. 14 months later, he signed away their pasture. They absorbed that too and bought Texas land instead, because Texas land could not be legislated out from under them. They absorbed the loss of the woman the town was named for. Electra Waggoner, who had built her own mansion on the ranch in 1910 and named it Zacahuesta, and who was one of the most conspicuous spenders in America in her generation, died on November 26, 1925, at 43. Her father buried her and kept building racetracks. They absorbed the 1930s. Cattle prices collapsed alongside everything else after 1929. Drought settled over the plains. And by 1934, the federal government was buying cattle off desperate ranchers across the drought states and destroying much of what it bought because there was no feed and no market and no other honest option. Ranchers, who had spent 40 years improving their herds, watched the improvement get shot in a pen. The Waggoner had oil income and survived the decade with the fence intact, which is not a moral fact. It is an accounting one. They absorbed December 11, 1934, when Tom Waggoner's stroke removed the only person alive who understood the whole machine at once. They could not absorb what happened in 1937. That year, the legislature repealed pari-mutuel betting 3 years after legalizing it. Arlington Downs, in its first full season of legal wagering, had run 650 horses, drawn an average of 6,734 spectators a day, and generated profits averaging $113,131 daily, roughly $2.7 million a day in today's money. The repeal turned all of it into a very large, empty building. And in the 1950s came the drought of record, 7 consecutive punishing years from 1950 through 1957 that broke ranchers across Texas. The Waggoner rebuilt after every one of these, and the reason was always the same. The oil under the ranch did not care about the weather, the legislature, or the cattle market. As long as the wells pumped, the surface could fail indefinitely. The decision that ended the Waggoner was made in 1923, and it was made by the man who built it. In 1909, Tom Waggoner had divided the ranch among his 3 children as a Christmas gift, giving Electra, Guy, and Paul roughly equal sub-ranches, and keeping a quarter section for himself, largely to teach them the business. 14 years later, he concluded they had not learned it. In 1923, he took the entire property back and placed it into a Massachusetts trust, the W.T. Waggoner Estate, with himself as trustee and his 3 children installed as a board of directors. At the time, this looked like prudence, and to be fair to him, it was. A trust protects land from division, from estate taxes, from in-laws, from a grandson with a bad idea and a good lawyer. It guaranteed the fence would stay unbroken. It also meant that from 1923 forward, every Waggoner descendant would own a share of something they could not sell, could not partition, and could not individually control, and the shares would keep subdividing with every birth, while the asset itself stayed exactly one asset. A trust is a machine for preventing a decision. Eventually, a family arrives that needs to make one. That family arrived in April 1991. Electra Waggoner Biggs, granddaughter of Tom Waggoner, sculptor of the Will Rogers statue that Dwight Eisenhower unveiled in Fort Worth in 1947, and the woman for whom General Motors named the Buick Electra, asked a district court to liquidate the estate and distribute the proceeds. Her second cousin, Albert Buckman Wharton III, universally called Bucky, moved to stop it and proposed splitting the ranch in half instead. Neither faction had the money to buy the other out. What followed was 25 years of litigation in the 46th Judicial District Court, first under Judge Tom Neely and then under Judge Dan Mike Bird, with a court-appointed receiver, Wilson Freiberg, overseeing an operation that employed roughly 120 people. Bucky Wharton and Jean Willingham, who had married into the Big Side, kept offices across a hallway from one another in the W.T. Waggoner Estate Building in Vernon, and communicated principally by written memo. For a time, the court was moving toward a forced auction, which would have cut the property into parcels and ended the single fence permanently. What stopped it was a stalking horse bid of $550 million presented to both families in the middle of the process, an offer that finally gave the 2 warring sides one thing they could agree on: opposing the auction. That agreement was the first in a quarter of a century. In August 2014, the ranch was listed instead as a single lot for $725 million, close to $1 billion in today's money, and brokers spent 18 months walking billionaires across it. On a February morning in 2016 in a Vernon courtroom, a judge approved its sale to Stan Kroenke, owner of the Los Angeles Rams and husband of a Walton heiress. The terms were never disclosed. They left. Not all at once. Some of these families had worked the same camps for 3 and 4 generations and did not go easily, but steadily, relentlessly, the way water leaves a broken vessel. Lake leases were terminated. Houses that had held the same surname since the Coolidge administration came up empty, with the furniture still inside, as though somebody had stepped out for an errand and would be back before dark. The ranch payroll fell from roughly 120 people to about 96. Out in Electra, where 6,712 people had lived in 1936, the 2020 census counted 2,282. Roughly 1 person remains for every 3 who were there when the pump jacks were new. What was liquidated first, and most completely, was the racetrack. Arlington Downs was sold to commercial developers after the 1937 repeal and spent 2 decades being demoted. It became county fairgrounds. It hosted Indy-style championship cars in 1947 and stock cars for a single season in 1951. Demolition began in 1953, and by the late 1950s, almost nothing was left of a facility that had cost the equivalent of $50 million. Salvage crews and local men pulled the grandstand apart for lumber, steel, and whatever else could be carried, and the land went under highways, office buildings, and eventually part of Six Flags Over Texas. One object survives in its original location. It is a concrete drinking fountain, etched with horses and jockeys, built sometime between 1929 and 1937. It is the last intact artifact of a racetrack that was intended to rival Churchill Downs, and it sits in front of an office tower named, without apparent irony, Arlington Downs Tower. The survivors are the cowboys, and the thing they understood is that the value was never the land. It was the work. Wes O'Neill hired on at the Waggoner in 1957 for $198.50 a month, about $2,200 today, and said it was a big deal to get on, that you nearly had to know somebody. Jimbo Glover walked through the gate for his first day in 1976 and was still working cattle nearly 50 years later, and says the daily job has not changed much. Bobby Daniel rode for the outfit from 1965 until the year it sold. In 2015, a Fort Worth photographer named Jeremy Enlow was given 3 months of access to those men and produced a book documenting 26 of them, published just as the sale went through. He said he wanted to preserve the way of life in case the new owner changed things. That book is now the most complete record of how the largest ranch in America actually operated. The bloodline survived as well, which is the closest thing to an heir this story produces. Poco Bueno sired 405 registered foals, 36 of them American Quarter Horse Association champions, and 3 that went into the National Cutting Horse Association Hall of Fame, horses carrying his bloodwork cattle in every state in the country. He has more documented descendants doing the job he was bred for than the family that bought him. The institution's held too. The Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, formed at Graham, Texas, in 1877 by Burke Burnett, C.C. Slaughter, Jim Loving, and both Waggoners, is still headquartered in Fort Worth. The Electra Historical Museum was dedicated in 1982 for the town's 75th anniversary. The Pumpjack Festival has run annually since 2002. At Doan's Crossing, the adobe building put up in 1881 is still standing, the oldest structure in Wilbarger County. And the ranch itself survives whole, roughly 525,000 contiguous acres under one fence, about 96 employees, the reversed Triple D still burned on the right hip. Drive US 287 west out of Wichita Falls today and you pass Electra before you have quite decided to. The population is around 2,272. The median household income is $69,167. The poverty rate is just under 20%. And 22.5% of the people who live there are 65 or older. On Main Street, the Grand Theater has been refurbished and works. Several storefronts have not. The pumpjacks are everywhere, in yards and fields and the margins of parking lots, most of them turning slowly, pulling a few barrels a day out of a formation that has been producing since 1911. Head south from Vernon on US 283, and the country opens into red dirt and mesquite and grass that runs to the horizon in every direction with no visible interruption for 25 miles. There is a fence. You will not see the far side of it. In Vernon, the museum keeps the Waggoner material, and a marker notes that Roy Orbison was born here in 1936, 4 years before the family that owned the county's grass finished its second generation. In late October, an hour before sunset, the light comes in flat across the red beds and every fence post throws a shadow 40 feet long. And the whole thing looks exactly the way it did when it was worth $1 billion, because it still is. Across from the gate at Zacawesta, the 4-ton granite marker is still standing, and the horse beneath it is still standing too, upright in the Permian clay facing the road. Poco Bueno has been buried there since 1969, which is longer than most of the people who worked this ranch got to stay on it. The family that put him there owned this land for 165 years and left almost nothing else on the surface to say so. They spent a quarter of a century in court arguing over how to divide something that had been deliberately built so that it never could be. And in the end, a stranger from Missouri bought the whole thing intact, exactly as designed. The monument was never really about the horse. It marks the only decision anyone in that family ever made about this land that everybody could agree on.